Thank you. Once again, it's my privilege and pleasure as patron to welcome you to this one-day conference, Fighting to the Finish. Australia in 1945, with the elements of strategy, victory, and its legacy. So, as I've said at previous conferences, and most of you will now know it, and again, for the record, Military History and Heritage Victoria was officially launched on the 4th of May 2011 by Professor Geoffrey Blaney. And those that were there, he challenged us to be relevant. And I believe that your committee have done that and have managed the challenge very well. Also, for the record, it's only to my record, unfortunately, this is the 20th such activity in those 14 years. If anyone wants to challenge me, I might get the figures absolutely right. However, back to this conference, Fighting to the Finish. We believe that the conference obviously covers an important and more often than most overlooked area of our military history. It just seems to be there, but I see it as Australia's home front, for the want of a very old expression, and mainly more back to Britain than to Australia. The sessions cover, after total war, what's next, the final battles, and the one that I was interested in, it's a short title, Casualties, but that covers the aftermath for Australia, including the closure of the war and obviously its legacy. I believe we've convened a balanced but diversified program for you with another excellent class of presenters. May I acknowledge and thank the co-conveners of this conference, David Phillipson and Michael Buckridge, who have brought together a program that covers such, again, another important phase of our World War II history. Pardon me. May I also acknowledge our military history sponsors, in particular Echo Books, and I see he's been doing a good bit of selling up there, as well as our colleagues of the History Guild and the RSL of Victoria, and in particular the staff of this venue. To you, the attendees, first of all, thank you for attending, and I certainly trust you enjoy the day. I am certainly looking forward to it once again. Now, may I introduce our Vice President, Lieutenant Colonel Murray Duckworth, as the first session chair to introduce our keynote speaker and very friendly man over many conferences with us, Professor David Horner. Murray.
Well, good morning all. As Jim said, welcome to MHHV conference for today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, David Horner, and David is, as Jim said, very well known to MHHV. And just a couple of things about David. I'm not going to go through David's bio because it's actually in your notes. You can read them. But I do note that David was a platoon commander in Vietnam. So David speaks with a wealth of practical experience and knowledge of the military, but also too from a very distinct academic side of the house. So it gives us great pleasure to welcome David today. Raman, He wasn't 6 RAR, mate, he was 3 RAR. So we won't hold that against him, okay?
Duty first.
Absolutely. There's a saying in the military, and for those who have served in the military, you train for the known and you educate for the unknown. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce David, who I'm sure will educate us all today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and again, it's a great joy to be down here in Melbourne speaking to this group, and it's always a great opportunity to meet up with people and find out what's going on in this military history business. Now, 2 months ago marked the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in the Pacific. Many of you will have seen on television the massive military show of force in Beijing to celebrate the PRC's role in defeating Japan. It was, of course, false history. The Chinese nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek played the dominant role in China's war against Japan, while the communists waited on the side, preparing for the civil war which they eventually won in 1949. The successor of the nationalist government now rules Taiwan, but of course there was no mention of the nationalist role in the Beijing celebrations. Nor did the celebrations mention that the most important country in defeating Japan was, by a huge margin, the United States. Australia too played an important part, especially in 1942 and 1943. But what can we say about Australia's effort in the last year of the war? Australia's war effort during the last year of the war has been the subject of considerable criticism, much of it ill-informed. Some historians have claimed that the operations in Bougainville and New Guinea were part of an unnecessary war. The British historian Sir Max Hastings went further when he claimed that as the war advanced, As the war advanced, grateful as were the Allies for Australia's huge contribution towards feeding their soldiers, there was sourness about the limited contribution by this country of 7 million people. According to Hastings, the Australians were bludging, claiming, for example, that the government cut the army's size by 22% because of the unpopularity of military service. These claims were a distortion of what happened. In July 1945, Australia had more infantry divisions, 6 of its 7, in action at one time than in any other month of the war. Hastings was, however, right in one respect. In the last year of the war, the Commander-in-Chief of the Southwest Pacific Area, General Douglas MacArthur, sidelined Australia's troops into campaigns that could not affect the outcome of the war. While it's important to examine views such as these, it's equally important to ask other questions. Why and how did Australia change its war strategy in 1944 and 1945? Were Australia's national interests advanced? The answers might help place Australia's war effort in a broader historical context. In considering these issues, it's important to remember that strategy is not just about the deployment of forces, it's also about the allocation of resources. Australia's war strategy in 1944-45 was built upon the strategy of earlier years. Australia's pre-war defence policy was based on imperial defence And as an outcome of this policy, in 1939 and 1940, Australian naval, land and air forces were deployed overseas to serve under British Commanders-in-Chief. After the outbreak of the war with Japan and the entry of the United States in December 1941, Allied higher direction of the war was assumed by US President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Australia had little influence over their deliberations. In April 1942, the American General MacArthur was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Southwest Pacific area, which included Australia and the islands to the north. While Australia was under threat of invasion, Prime Minister John Curtin placed Australia's forces under MacArthur's command. And Curtin also looked to MacArthur for advice on strategic matters. And Australia's war strategy in 1942 was relatively simple. Australia needed to raise and sustain as large an army as possible to resist a possible Japanese invasion. Curtin also needed to persuade Roosevelt and Churchill to send resources to help defend Australia and to mount a counter-offensive against the Japanese. Unfortunately for Australia, Roosevelt and Churchill had agreed on a policy of beating Hitler first, thus relegating the Pacific theatre to secondary importance. With little capacity to influence Roosevelt and Churchill, Curtin found a ready ally in MacArthur who wanted to return to the Philippines and applied his own pressure to the US Joint Chiefs of Staff to reinforce his theatre. Now, Australia's war strategy at this time was determined by three interrelated bodies. The first was the War Cabinet, which was chaired by Curtin, who was also Minister for Defence, and included 7 other senior ministers. The Chiefs of Staff of the three services were attended as advisors. Sir Frederick Shedden, Secretary to the Department of Defence, was Secretary to the War Cabinet. The second body was the Advisory War Council, which was also chaired by Curtin and included 4 War Cabinet ministers and 4 members of the federal opposition. Again, the Chief of Staff attended and Shedden was the Secretary. The third, perhaps the most important body in the higher direction of the war was the Prime Minister's War Conference, which consisted of Curtin, MacArthur, Shedden, and any other minister or advisor invited by Curtin. General Sir Thomas Blamey, Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Army, attended the War Cabinet when invited, but crucially was not a member of the Prime Minister's War Conference. So Curtin, MacArthur, Shedden and Blamey were the key figures in deciding Australia's war strategy. In the Allied command structure, Blamey was commander of the Allied land forces, in addition to his role as Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Army. The Australian Army carried the heaviest burden in the fighting in Papua in 1942 and in the New Guinea offensives of 1943. Now, the foundation for Australia's war strategy in the last 2 years of the war was set by the War Cabinet on the 1st of October 1943. And there were several reasons why it needed to consider a new war strategy. Facing the threat of possible invasion in early 1942, Australia had raised an army of some 13 divisions. But after the heavy casualties in Papua, the army was beginning to face shortages in manpower. The strategic situation had also changed substantially. Australia was no longer under threat of invasion. The Japanese had been driven out of Papua and Australian forces were reconquering New Guinea. And against this background, on the 1st of October 1943, the War Cabinet agreed that by June 1944, 20,000 men should be released from the armed forces. 10,000 men should be released from the munitions and aircraft industries. And the monthly intake into the services should be fixed at 5,000 men and women. But there was no commitment to reducing substantially the forces fighting in the Southwest Pacific area. And the War Cabinet affirmed a key principle. It is of vital importance to the future of Australia and her status at the peace table in the Pacific that her military effort should be concentrated as far as possible in the Pacific, and that it should be on a scale to guarantee her an effective voice in the peace settlement. Now, however much there might have been an air of expediency in the government's decision, we can now see that it was a major turning point in the history of Australian strategic and defence policy. In the First World War, Australia deployed forces overseas to help the Empire to win the war. Similarly, at the beginning of the Second World War, Australia sent forces to help the Imperial War effort in the European theatre. Forces were sent to Malaya, the Netherlands East Indies and New Guinea to help ensure the security of Australia, culminating in the Papuan and New Guinea campaigns of 1942 and 1943. But after 1944, Australian forces were deployed for purely political purposes to guarantee a voice in the peace settlement. And the harsh fact is that if Australian forces had conducted no more offensive operations after 1944, there would have been no change in the outcome of the war. Furthermore, over the next 70 years, Australia deployed forces to 7 more wars for political purposes. Again, if Australia had not contributed forces, there would have been no change in the outcome. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that these commitments were wrong, or that in some way they did not contribute to Australian security. And this broader view underlies the importance of the decisions of October 1943. In the short term, however, it was clear that the Australian Army would have little offensive role in the coming operations. The Army had deployed 5 divisions during the New Guinea offensives, and these were progressively withdrawn to Australia for rest and retraining. American forces would take over the Southwest Pacific Area offensive as it moved along the north coast of New Guinea. So having decided on its course of action, the government needed to get the concurrence of the British and American governments. I don't intend to describe Curtin's visit in America and Britain to get this approval, but essentially both countries did agree to Australia's strategy. Australia would maintain 6 divisions for active operations. The Royal Australian Navy was to stay at its present strength. The RAAF was to be maintained at a strength of 54 squadrons. Food for Britain, including to India, was to be exported on the 1944 scale, and Australia was to review other aspects of its war effort to see if production could be increased. And I don't intend to discuss either the arguments over whether Australian forces should be involved in the Philippines, nor will I discuss the arguments over the reduction of manpower in the armed forces. But I do need to mention that on the 31st of December 1944, there were just over 34,000 personnel in the Navy, more than 410,000 in the Army, and almost 180,000 in the Air Force. And this was a very substantial force from a country of 7 million people. So much for Hastings' claim that we were bludgeoning. So rather than follow the course of the disputes, I want to briefly describe Australia's campaigns in the last year of the war. In some campaigns, the Australians served as part of a larger Allied force. In these cases, the campaigns were generally important to the outcome of the war. But although the Australian contributions were valuable, they were not crucial to the success of those campaigns. Other campaigns were conducted largely by Australian forces, but the importance of these campaigns to the outcome of the war is open to question. Australia's role in both of these sorts of campaigns illustrates the problems faced by a small country in a large coalition war once the strategic focus moves away from the geographic area of the small country. It was the Royal Australian Navy and the RAAF, the Royal Australian Air Force, which had the most involvement with other Allied campaigns. The RAN squadron, generally with 2 cruisers and several destroyers, had operated with the American naval forces throughout the Southwest Pacific area from early 1942. And this relationship continued during the American landings at Leyte in October 1944 and in Luzon in January 1945. In both battles, the Australian flagship HMAS Australia was attacked by Japanese kamikaze aircraft, and after the second battle had to be withdrawn from operations. While the Australian cruiser squadron continued to operate under American command, it was deployed also to support Australian amphibious operations in the last 3 months of the war. Other Australian ships served as part of the British fleet. For example, 3 destroyers were involved in operations along the coast of Burma in December 1944 and January 1945. And these ships accompanied the British Pacific Fleet that deployed to the Pacific in early 1945. Several Australian destroyers helped defend the British fleet train in the Pacific, while 2 destroyers, Quiberon and Quickmatch, were with the British fleet in its operations off Formosa in April and Japan in July 1945. Individually, or as part of formed units, members of the RAAF supported other Allied campaigns. In May 1945, at the end of the war in Europe, there were still 16,000 Australian airmen serving in the European theatre. Some 1,700 Australian airmen served in the Burma campaign, dispersed among 60 British squadrons. And at this point, I want to congratulate Andrew Kilsby and Darryl Moran on their just published book about the Australian airmen in this campaign. The RAAF's 1st Tactical Air Force, with 8 flying squadrons, helped support the American Air Force during the Leyte campaign between October and December 1944. But thereafter, the Australians remained at their bases at Morotai and in New Guinea to conduct operations in these areas. The RAAF was not directly involved in the later Philippines campaign, including the Luzon operations, except for 2 important units, an airfield construction squadron and a detachment of the 1st Wireless Unit, which provided General MacArthur with priceless radio intelligence. In the last year of the war, the RAAF conducted 2 campaigns of its own. The first was undertaken by Northwest Area, with its headquarters at Darwin. Australian liberators from bases in the Northern Territory and northern Western Australia attacked enemy shipping and installations in the Netherlands, East Indies. Catalinas also laid mines around Java and elsewhere. The second campaign was undertaken by the 1st Tactical Air Force against similar targets in the Netherlands, East Indies. The RAAF pilots found it hard to accept that these operations against lone coastal vessels and barges far to the south of the main area of operations could have any importance. And in April 1944, several officers at Morotai tried to resign their commissions. The RAAF concern at being sidetracked on unnecessary operations reflect similar concerns about the major operations undertaken by Australian Army divisions with naval and air support in New Guinea, Bougainville and Borneo during the same period. From October 1944 onwards, Australian troops began to arrive on Bougainville, New Britain as well, and around Itapi on the north coast of New Guinea. to replace American units which had been defending positions near large Japanese enclaves left behind as the war had moved northwards. General Blamey had only wanted to use 7 brigades for this task, but MacArthur insisted on 12 brigades. On New Britain, the 5th Australian Division pushed the Japanese garrison back into the Gazelle Peninsula, where it remained until the end of the war. Australian casualties were 74 deaths. And at the end of the war, the Japanese garrison at Rabaul was found to number almost 70,000 Army and Navy personnel. It took some time for the Australian forces to be built up on Bougainville, but in April, the 2nd Corps there began a slow and careful offensive which was continuing at the end of the war, and at that time over 500 Australians had been killed. Over 18,000 Japanese had been killed or had died of illness, and more than 23,000 surrendered. At Itapi, the 6th Division began an advance towards Wewak, which was captured in May. By the end of the war, the Japanese had been driven into the mountains. The Australians had 442 deaths, more than 1,000 wounded, and more than 16,000 admitted to hospital with tropical and other diseases. About 9,000 Japanese had been killed, and many more died of illness, and more than 13,000 surrendered. Now, even at the time, there was considerable controversy over the need for these campaigns. When asked by the Australian Prime Minister, John Curtin, MacArthur replied that if he was doing the job himself, he wouldn't jeopardise a single Australian life in an offensive in these back areas. Yet, American forces were undertaking similar operations in the southern Philippine Islands. Eventually, in May 1945, Blamey explained the reasons for these offensives to the War Cabinet, which gave him retrospective endorsement. It's now clear that the offensives had no bearing on the outcome of the war, and even at the time, many soldiers resented the loss of lives in unnecessary battles. Yet Blamey's case was persuasive. He was not to know that the war would end in August, and the best way to withdraw his troops from these back areas was to eliminate the Japanese forces there. And this was important not only to meet the demands for demobilisation, but also to make troops available for the invasion of the mainland of Japan, the main island of Japan, in March 1946. And there were other considerations. The Japanese forces were occupying Australian mandated territories. As Blamey argued, were we to wait until Japan was finally crushed, it could be said that the Americans, who had previously liberated the Philippines, were responsible for the final liberation of the natives in Australian territories, with the inevitable result that our prestige, both abroad and in the eyes of the natives, would suffer much harm. Furthermore, some Americans had spoken of securing economic advantages in the areas liberated by their own troops. Blamey said that the Australian external territories were not only undeveloped dependent areas, they were also Australia's defence rampart. And finally, Curtin and some members of the Cabinet felt there was the continued role would strengthen their position in the coming peace treaty negotiations. Now, the issue revealed several weaknesses in the process for deciding strategic issues within the Australian government. For much of the time, Curtin was sick, but in any case, the responsibility for the employment of Australian forces had been given to General MacArthur. In July 1945, the new Australian Prime Minister, Ben Chifley, wrote to MacArthur to complain that the government had assumed that the operations had been conducted with his approval. He said that the government was greatly embarrassed to learn that this was not the case, as it had publicly defended the wisdom of these operations. MacArthur didn't deign to reply to the Australian government. Now, if MacArthur was at the best lukewarm about the operations in the Australian mandated territories, he was the main advocate of the operations in Borneo. The first of these began on the 1st of May 1945, when the 26th Brigade, supported by the 1st Tactical Air Force and an Allied fleet, including Australian ships, landed on the island of Tarakan, off the northeast coast of Borneo. The purpose was to seize an airfield to support further operations in Borneo and to gain control of the oil installations. By the time the island was secured towards the end of June, the Australians had lost 225 killed and almost 700 wounded. The airfield could not be repaired in time to use it during the coming operations, and the oil fields took a further year to bring back to production. The next landing took place on the 10th of June, when 2 brigades of the 9th Division landed on Labuan Island and the Brunei mainland. MacArthur and the US Joint Chiefs of Staff had been keen to undertake this operation for various reasons. It was the first step in liberating a British colony in the Southwest Pacific area. It established a presence on the South China Sea, and it provided a base for the British Pacific Fleet. But in fact, the British had never wanted to base their fleet there. But the Americans were trying to steer them away from Manus Island or the Philippines. The Australians lost 114 killed during the North Borneo operations. Now, General Blamey had generally supported the first 2 operations in Borneo, even though it was now obvious that they had no effect on the war. He thought that the operations tended to increase control of the sea area between Malaya and Japan, and in any case, he understood that they'd been approved by the Combined Chiefs of Staff. The Combined Chiefs of Staff consisted of the British and American Chiefs of Staff, and they were responsible for overall Allied strategy. Neither operation prevented the tragedy of the Sandakan Death March, in which 2,000 Australian prisoners perished. But it might be asked whether some of the resources available for these landings could have been used to rescue the prisoners. But Blamey, as well as his subordinate corps and divisional commanders and the supporting naval and air force commanders, were opposed to the 3rd operation, the landing of the 7th Division at Balikpapan on the east coast of Borneo. On the 16th of May, Blamey wrote to the government recommending the withdrawal of the 7th Division from the operation. Earlier, he'd criticised a proposed advance down the east coast of Borneo, and now he thought that the 7th Division would become involved in garrison duties and would not be available for the invasion of Japan. In response to a query from the acting Australian Prime Minister, Ben Chifley, MacArthur told him that to cancel the operation would disorganise completely not only the immediate campaign, but also the strategic plan of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And this message arrived in Canberra on a Sunday, and the ministers were scattered in various parts of the Commonwealth. So Sir Frederick Shedden, the Secretary of the Department, drafted a reply, took it to Curtin in hospital, and MacArthur was informed that the Australian government approved the operation. What the Australians did not know was that MacArthur had told the Joint Chiefs that the Balikpapan operation was necessary because not to carry it out would produce grave repercussions with the Australian government and people. The truth was that MacArthur wanted to capture Balikpapan so that he could show the Dutch government that he had tried to recover parts of their territory. It was not a reason that appealed to either the Australian government or the Joint Chiefs. Following the landing, which took place on the 1st of July, a total of 229 Australians were killed and 634 were wounded. Japan did not surrender 1 minute earlier because of this campaign. Now, while there are a number of books about the Borneo campaign, I might mention that there is a recent publication called Borneo, the last campaign by Michael Veitch that's just come out recently. So with the advantage of hindsight, it's now easy to question the value of Australian campaigns in 1945. But several issues must be considered. Firstly, the Australian forces were still under MacArthur's strategic direction, although perhaps the command arrangements should have been reviewed during the previous year. Secondly, flowing from the previous point, the Australian government had not developed an effective process for determining strategic policy. And the ineffective process that was in existence was hampered by the sickness of the Prime Minister after October 1944. Thirdly, once the Americans had been able to deploy their powerful naval and air forces against Japan in 1945, there was never going to be much scope for Australian involvement. After carrying much of the burden in the South Pacific area in the earlier stages of the war, the Australian government was determined that Australia would have some say in the peace process. Australia was no longer fighting for its survival. It could no longer even make a major contribution to the defeat of Japan. But the government could, and indeed had a responsibility, to look to the future security of the country. This is, of course, cold comfort to the many Australians who lost sons, brothers or fathers during 1945. But the politicians and military leaders who made the decisions in 1945 were hoping that the country would never again have to face such a threat. If the fighting of 1945 helped contribute to the decades of peace enjoyed by Australians for 80 years, it was certainly not in vain. So let me conclude with some comments on the legacy of the last year of the war. Australia's involvement in the whole Second World War had a much broader legacy, such as the industrialisation of Australia, the development of the Commonwealth Government, the post-war immigration scheme and the enduring relationship with the United States. But I want to focus more narrowly just on the last year of the war. In that case, the first legacy is that Australia's armed forces had developed a level of military expertise that far surpassed anything displayed in the earlier years of the war. Commanders and their staffs were now highly experienced. The techniques of jungle warfare had been refined, and there was an enhanced level of inter-service cooperation, demonstrated by the successful amphibious landings in Borneo. And this experience carried over into the post-war period. The expertise shown by Australia's naval, army and air forces in the Korean War followed on from that displayed in 1945. The second legacy is Australia's relationship with Indonesia. Australian forces not only liberated Tarakan and Balikpapan, but were deployed to other Indonesian islands to facilitate the Japanese surrenders there. It was no accident that Brigadier Lewis Dyke, who accepted the Japanese surrender in Timor, headed the Australian peacekeeping observers who went to Indonesia in 1947. The third legacy is that Australia's contribution to the war in 1945 led directly to its inclusion in the Japanese occupation force and enabled Australia to demand that it provide the force's commander. Australia therefore became recognised as a Pacific power. Therefore, Australia's military operations in 1945 should not be seen as some sort of postscript to the mighty and iconic battles of earlier in the war. Rather, the battles of 1945 not only concluded Australia's substantial contribution to the war, but provided a bridge to the future. Well, thank you very much, and I'd be very happy to answer the questions.
Thanks very much, David. Any questions from the floor? Are there any questions? Yes, up the back.
You talked about the OVO operations not being of much use, but after the Burma campaign, would the British invasion of Malaya and Singapore have made the Borneo operations of vital importance by being able to support them from the east?
It's a moot point, of course. I'm not absolutely convinced by that. In what way would they support it? And I'm not sure about that. It was sort of put about that by taking, particularly North Borneo, it gave us a greater capacity to control the South China Sea. We can only do that, of course, if the forces are made available to do it. And who was controlling the forces? General MacArthur. So yeah, maybe so if that had gone ahead. But it's a good bit of speculation.
If we were to regard Essington Lewis as the equivalent in our theatre to Speer in Germany, how effective was his command of the economy here in fighting to the finish?
Well, you've got to, I mentioned right at the end there that one of the outcomes of the broader war was the industrialisation of Australia. And in many ways it was an absolutely remarkable achievement. There's a country of 7 million people, in all about 1 million of them in the armed forces, with others working flat out, growing crops to supply not only us but the Americans and Britain. And in all that, we managed to build aircraft, ships, many corvettes were constructed. And so that we do have a remarkable industrialisation of Australia, which continued, of course, into the 1950s and 1960s. And if Essington Lewis is the mastermind of that, well, he should be certainly given credit for that. But it's an issue of the whole war rather than an issue of the last year of the war, because the things I'm talking about, many of them were coming into production much earlier than the last year of the war.
Do you see an area where Australian forces could have been employed that could have been more beneficial than what they were deployed to do?
No, I had an email within the last week from Rich Frank. Now, some of you might know that Rich Frank is a very distinguished American historian of the Pacific War. And one of the big arguments has been that MacArthur kept Australia out of the Philippines. He kept Australia out of the Philippines because Americans wanted to be seen to be recovering the Philippines. It was nice to have the Australian Corps on tap if something went wrong, so let's not use it. But Rich Frank was saying that he ran across a document recently in the archives where General Richard Marshall, not George Marshall, Richard Marshall, who's MacArthur's one of senior officers, went to Washington, and so the story goes that Rich Frank tells me that Marshall was given an option that he couldn't refuse, and that is that if MacArthur speeded up his campaign and went straight to Luzon, then the Joint Chiefs of Staff would throw their weight behind MacArthur. That meant that the plan to use the 1st Australian Division at the north of Luzon was then abandoned. This is what Rich Frank tells me. The other story, the one that I've put about, is that was abandoned because MacArthur didn't want the Australians to be involved. So as far as I can see, that would be one area where Australia could have made a major contribution. We've moved forward into the Philippines. But we've got to remember that also, on the 1st of May, the Americans landed on Okinawa. And I have written anywhere, it's not just me, others have written too, that once the Americans landed on Okinawa, everything that happened south of Okinawa were strategically irrelevant. Once the Americans were in Okinawa, closing in on Japan, bombing Japan, mining the waters around Japan, Japanese ships sunk by submarines, closing in on Japan, in other words. Everything south is strategically irrelevant. So, unless Australia took part in the planned invasion of Japan, it was pretty well hard to find anywhere where Australians would fight that would make a substantial contribution to ending the war. It's got Tim George.
Thank you. Thank you for that very fascinating and very fair account of what happened. Now, Robin Pryor once said, I think, that there was a joke in MacArthur's headquarters that Mountbatten's command, SEAC, should really be called Save England's Asian Colonies. You hinted during your speech that there was a little bit of manoeuvring about resources and prestige going on. And perhaps America might take things if Britain or Australia didn't. Do you think that was in any way a factor in, say, going after the oil fields of Borneo the way that they did?
I haven't found anything about going to the oil fields in Borneo. I've certainly seen about Manus Island, for example. They want to take Manus Island, that would make a nice place out there in the Pacific. But no, nothing about. You've got to remember too that the President Roosevelt was very strong on trying to do away with colonies, and that hence the comment about Southeast Asian Command covering British colonies. So it would be a little bit hypocritical, wouldn't it? So be criticising Britain for trying to recover its colonies while we're planning to grab a few colonies
Yes.
of our own. Yes. So I don't think, though, that their eyes on the oil of continental Greece. I think Tim's.
I was just going to ask, as you said, there was no perhaps reason to believe that the war was going to end with Japan in 1945. With the plan to extend the war then all the way through to an invasion of southern Japan and then the Tokyo area itself in 1946, is there an argument that the Australian operations in Borneo and particularly Balikpapan with the divisional size landing might have given the Australian government an argument to press against MacArthur to be included in either of those landing operations against the home islands of Japan?
There might have been, but I think we can turn it around the other way. That given what Australian policy was, to have a say in the peace treaty, I think we would have felt that we need to be represented there in the invasion of Japan, and not just represented by a few ships, but represented by at least a division in the invasion of Japan. So certainly that was in Blamey's thinking, that on one hand he wants to reduce the size of the Australian Army. The best way to reduce it is to eliminate the areas where they're fighting. But secondly, to release then troops that would take part in the invasion of Japan. And you're quite right in saying it's going to be in two steps: southern Japan and then the main part of Honshu. So it is a possibility that we could say, okay, we've done our duty in Borneo, but I haven't seen anywhere written that that was the reason why we went to Borneo. You might say another thing though, right, one of the points I made is that following on from those campaigns, there's a good chance that if we did send a division, it would have been a pretty well trained and experienced division that would have gone there.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. You mentioned Blamey having to present an argument to the Australian War Cabinet to justify the offensives in the mandated territories by the 1st Australian Army. I'd like you to reflect a little bit more on that. I mean, my memory is that part of Blamey's argument was that because MacArthur in the Philippines was not just liberating key points that could be used as bases for the advance towards Japan, that he was determined to liberate the entire Philippines because there was a moral imperative to do so, to liberate people from Japanese occupation and to restore American prestige. And Blamey, it seems to me, was trying to mount the same case for the Australian offences in New Guinea, that this was Australian territory, or a territory that Australia was responsible for, that there were, you know, as he would have called them, native peoples under a brutal occupation, and that we had not just a need to reduce our commitment militarily, but a moral commitment to liberating these people.
The only criticism I'd make of the government of this is that it took until May 1945 when the government decided that they'd get Blamey in to try and explain what was going on. I mean, that's not the way you run a campaign. I mean, the government should make a decision and tell the military to do something. Here we've got the military did something, and 6 months later the government said, oh, perhaps we better find out why this is happening. So I would criticise that. But on the other hand, I think Blamey made a good case. You might put it now another way. What would happen if the Japanese had captured North Queensland? Would the government have said, oh no, we won't recover North Queensland, we'll wait till the war is over and then we'll get it back then? Would the people of Australia put up with that? Is the only difference because these people are black and we're white that we leave them to the Japanese? No, they're people that are under our control, and therefore we should recover them. That's the sort of argument that Blamey is put, and I think it's a very, very reasonable argument that is being put forward there.
The territorial imperative, there's good evidence that in what you've said and what this question has said too. I'm not questioning that, but the issue for America was quite a bit different to the issue faced by Australia in that context, because the Philippines were really, in many ways, an American colony. Now, the fact is, the Americans suffered great shame with their retreat. Well, I suppose it was a withdrawal in strict terms, but the withdrawal along the Corregidor Peninsula and so forth. Now, that shame brought MacArthur into world focus, because his famous words to the Filipinos, "I shall return." The Americans really didn't have little option if it was to preserve its own territorial objectives in the colonial setting, whilst trying to undermine the British in the same, what's the word, pursuit, for different reasons. But the agreement that the British and the Americans reached with the ageing destroyers and the ceding of British sovereignty over the islands and so forth, Lend Lease. That was an objective, a political objective to effectively diminish British sovereignty in the world.
You're right about the view about the Philippines, but it's more focused on MacArthur because, I shall return. You've got to remember that, in fact, it was not a done deal that the Americans were going to go to the Philippines, because strategy in the Pacific was being run from two areas. The Southwest Pacific area being run out of Hawaii. It's being run by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, and one of the most powerful men there was Admiral King, Chief of Naval Operations. And they saw things in a slightly different way. They saw things purely in a strategic sense. Their job is to defeat Japan. And therefore, it doesn't really matter if you recover the Philippines or not. What we've got to do is we've got to close in on Japan and defeat Japan. So you've got that argument running, and then you've got the argument that you put in mentioning, which is really being pushed by MacArthur. And ultimately, that argument was accepted, that they're going to go to the Philippines. But it was, and while the sort of views that you're putting are very strong ones that were held by many people, it was not held by everybody. And certainly others, it was a purely in a military sense, yeah, we've got to close in on Japan, get our forces closer to Japan so we can isolate Japan and defeat Japan.
We might hold off on those two questions, if you don't mind. Certainly, David, you'll be around for the rest of the day.
Yes.
So I guess you could hound David for those couple of questions. Thanks very much, David. Really enlightening. And I mentioned about educational. I've been educated today, certainly. And I'd like to talk to you in a break some stage. Jump from 1945 to 2025. You mentioned our relationship with Indonesia, our relationship with Papua New Guinea and the recent signing of that agreement. I'd be interested in your comments on that at some stage. So please join me in thanking David. Thank you.